Elvis's heart. And that was an accident rather than set up. A defense of architecture was what I had in mind, but I didn't realize who the target was going to be until talking with Evan a little while ago. I'm going to be talking in two parts. One, about what I consider to be a necessary defense of architecture. And then I'm going to show a project that Andy Saunders, who is one of your teachers, did in my office. And I think it's an extraordinary project. I hope that Andy can take some of you to it, because every time I go there, I'm overwhelmed by it, and I think to myself, how the hell who did this? Because I don't feel at all responsible. Of course, Andy, I think, was the only guy in the office at the time that knew how to do Rhino or Maya, and made the wireframe model for this craziness, which extends for hundreds of drawings. So anyway, that's partly set up. The defense of architecture started in my mind months ago, when I knew I was coming here, and then it's the first time I've given this lecture, so I've got pieces of paper all over the place. It's not quite together. But what happened in my life 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to go to a conference in Germany on the culture of cities. And I was asked to be the closing speaker on the culture of cities. And Peter Cook was the opening speaker on this. And I looked at the material that they had put out, what the culture of cities was about, and it was about, the exhibition and stated purpose was the beginning and the end of the Bilbao effect. And I thought to myself, well, Peter Cook could be called the beginning of the Bilbao effect, but I'm the end of the Bilbao effect. The end? I said, I don't want to be the end. I don't even know if I'm in the Bilbao effect. And then I thought to myself, hey, there's a problem here. And so I wrote to the organizers and said that I didn't think I should appear at this conference, and especially as it's labeled the beginning and the end of the Bilbao effect. And they wrote back and said, what a strange view of the world you have. Don't you realize that soup kitchens are as important as architecture? This is written to me. And I thought to myself, huh? Soup kitchens are as, to whom? Chefs? And then they clearly mean people who are poor or undernourished or whatever. And I said, architecture has nothing to do with this. And then I realized something suddenly happened to me, that architecture is being consumed by the new bottom-up mentality. And I thought to myself, RPI is a great place to argue against bottom-up, because here are a bunch of students, 200, 300 students, paying $40,000, $50,000 a year, who want to encourage bottom-up when they're sitting on the top, and willing to pay $40 to stay on the top. They want bottom-up. And I thought, this would be a great speech for them, because if I can get them to walk out of here, right, and get their money back because they're in a bottom-up mentality, I think I want to do that. And I warned Evan that that's what I was going to do tonight, that bottom-up is destroying architecture. Okay, start. This past summer, I was invited to be in the 17th Venice Biennale, which was called Common Ground. And I thought, what the hell is common ground? And I realized that it wasn't like we mean like a burial place or a town green. What it meant was bottom-up ground, common, right? And I realized, hey, I'm against common. I'm interested in uncommon. That's why I pay $41,000 to have my kid educated here. I want uncommon. And Bob Stern, my dean at Yale, was quoted 2 weeks ago in the New York Times saying, this was a wonderful solution to a problem because it made common sense. And I thought, oh my God, there it goes again. My dean, the Venice Biennale, the people in Berlin running this exhibition. I said, it's metastasizing all over the world. I said, common and bottom-up mentality ever since Occupy Wall Street. Everybody wants to be in the 99%. It's cozy being in the 99%. Nobody wants to be an elitist anymore. But what you have to realize, to be an architect means to be an expert. And to be an expert means that you have an uncommon education because architecture is difficult. Like being a chef, like being a conductor of an orchestra, you are a conductor. You have to know more than the musicians. You cannot have a common knowledge. And so I thought to myself, let's organize a talk based on this problem that I see around. Okay, there are two people who arguing recently against this idea of common ground. One is Mario Carpo in his article, The Digital Darwinism, which was in log 26, I believe, or 26. And also Pierre Vittorio Reilly in his article, The Theology of the Tabula Rasa, which was in log 27. Both of these gentlemen are talking about what has come over architecture and the digital revolution. And a matter of fact, Carpo is organizing a conference on the digital turn. Now, as Evan reminds me, Greg Lynn is having an exhibition next year, a major exhibition that he's curating called The Archaeology of the Digital. And who are two of the major four players in this, but Frank Gehry and Peter Eisanman. And as Evan so rightly reminds me, that my work seemed to be about the movement toward what computers are now doing. And so I realized something has gone off when I'm here lecturing against what in fact is happening. I want to read you 3 paragraphs quickly from O'Reilly's The Theology of the Tabula Rasa. He says, since the 2007 economic recession, the culture of architecture has witnessed the rise of activism and participatory practices. That is, people voting on what they want, people participating in the process in a sort of bottom-up way. By promoting new ways of practicing architecture that invest design with a social and political mission. The new generation of architects, that's you all, feel the urge to focus not on aesthetic and formal concerns, but on the improvement of our urban condition. Nobody could say there's anything wrong with that. The crisis, the economic and social crisis of today, is forcing the architectural discipline to be more inventive, more disposable in the sense of being environmentally appropriate, more astute in finding ad hoc solutions for our crumbling urban condition. Ad hoc, that is soup kitchens. But it's this kind of creativity, and this is where O'Reilly's political argument comes in. This kind of creativity is precisely what capitalism has seized as its main labor power. Doing more with less is precisely what capital demands from us. More productivity and less welfare. More creativity and less social security. So all of you who think of yourselves as politically from the bottom up on leaning left, you ought to hear what an out-and-out Marxist has to say about this social activism. The new socially oriented architectural activism poses a dilemma that cannot be avoided. These new practices are these new practices addressing the possibility of radical change, or are they simply confirming and to a certain extent sublimating the most regressive effects of this economic crisis? To the conclusion of the essay. Once the working class is no longer represented as a threat, as has happened in the last 40 years of the neoliberal economy, capital would dismiss its social democratic tendency. Ironically, the rise of activism and participation complements the dismissal of the top-down welfare state. Aestheticizing, number 2, aestheticizing the self-help living conditions of poor people squatting in buildings becomes an attractive option when there is no welfare social housing. And yet, even more problematic is that participatory practices attempt to compensate for this situation with strategies that see our increasingly precarious life as something normal, even creative. And finally, from of many hands is the dissolution of authorship. Now, one, I suppose, is paying money to this school to find out what it means to be an author. And he says that social interaction creates bonds that the romantic identification with nature often likes to break, which is a very different thing than what is being practiced in the digital. So what we're talking about is that the new idea that processes of design mirror or are analogous to natural emergence, etc., is a new form of vitalism. And as far as I can see, vitalism was an idea that was energizing modernism in the 30s, and again in the 60s and 70s. I thought it had been finally beaten back. Well, what you realize is those things somehow don't go away. And self-determination and self-selection based on environmental feedback are as strong today in the parametric and digital turn that one has to take notice. Back in 1960 to 63, when I was doing my PhD dissertation at Cambridge, a book was published by a man called Christian Norberg Schultz called Intentions in Architecture. It was a very important book because it was the first book talking about phenomenology. And what we subsequent books by Norbert Schultz, actually called The Phenomenology of Architecture, is a misreading of Heidegger's view of phenomenology. In other words, a simplistic reading of phenomenology, which is followed by people like Richard Sennett, who wrote a book called The Craftsman, Johanni Pallasmaa, who's a juror on the Pritzker Prize, and others who have taken over the ground, the central ground of architecture. And so phenomenology basically deals with the presence of things, that is, the material presence of things, material nature of form. And what I'm going to show you tonight is the fact that the authorship that I'm talking about is talking about the possibility of things which are not there. That is, not so much the material being of what's there, but rather what is traced, but what might have been there, what could be there. And so I'm arguing against this digital phenomenology, digital Darwinism, as Carpo calls it, because what I'm saying is that my work has always been different than presence, but talking about the absence of things that were formerly or could be present. And that is what I've always called and been called the diagram. And so the work that I'm going to show tonight begins from an inherent architectural diagram and is also part of a system of notation, not obvious metaphorical references to things like ships and boats and things that people like Le Corbusier were talking about, but rather to a system of notation which is not associated with any other thing, but rather a notation that talks about the time of its object, the record of its coming into being, and issues which are very different than pure presence. And this is a very different kind of authorship than what is being talked about in the digital phenomenon. I say that the difference is in two pairs. One, I'm interested in the diagram versus the algorithm. And for me, the algorithm has no inherent architectural competence. It may allow one to make beautiful shapes and forms in architecture, but are these forms either critical or intelligent in terms of their relationship to the discipline of architecture? Whereas the diagram always contains, as it will, you will see, an architectural impulse. So the algorithm is tone deaf when it comes to this kind of notation. The second pair that I think is important is the formal versus the textual. Not textural, but textual. And a formal discourse is one where forms have a single iteration. They, because architecture is static, no matter how much we'd like it to move, where the architectural form signifies something. It represents something. And that's the traditional form of architectural thinking. Textual and textuality is where the architectural form doesn't signify or represent anything, but suggests a universe of possible meanings. And so it is not, in a sense, stable or static. And what you'll see in the project that I'm going to show you tonight is that it is, in fact, a textual project. It's a diagrammatic project. It is not about presence, but about, in fact, a series of absences. So it is anti-phenomenological. and ultimately anti-bottom-up, because no one else could have, I mean, a group of people in the town where I'm working could never have conceptualized a critical idea about the discipline because they don't know about the discipline. And that's why in this world, of this bottom-up world, the expert becomes even more necessary. Because without the expert, there's no way of controlling the populist impulse, the irrational, romantic ideas, and we know where those kinds of things go to. So my feeling is that architecture and architecture schools are really more important today than ever, more important than the architectural office. And my idea is that the school is a speed bump between not knowing anything and practicing architecture. There's no way, that is, what is a speed bump? It's slowing you down. Now, a lot of you are thinking, I'm here because I need to get a job and I will get a good job, etc. If you get a good job out of college and you haven't slowed up, it'll never be a good job. What you need to do is take the time while you're here to learn about what architecture is, what makes it a critical discipline in the society, why has it always been a top-down, why has the society always looked to great works, while, say, Troy has a great stock of wonderful, ordinary buildings, it also has a great stock of extraordinary buildings. And without the extraordinary buildings, Troy would be just an ordinary place. It happens not to be an ordinary place, but one which contains extraordinary buildings. I believe, despite this bottom-up approach, that architecture needs icons, it needs great work, and it needs people who are trained to understand what that is, not as flash in the pan or one-liners, but something that is mature and asks critical questions about the evolution of a discipline. So while I may sound like a conservative today, I'm really not, because I've always believed, and I wrote a book called 10 Canonical Buildings, and I've always believed that in order to have heresy, you have to have canon. And if you only had canon, you would have a very dull world. So canon is necessary to have heresy. And what I believe the bottom-up does is gives you canon. The top-down gives you heresy. And all of you should be being trained to be heretics, to be not believing what your teachers say, not believing what I say, not believing anything but questioning everything. And you have to learn how to do that. It takes time and a lot of energy. And my advice to anybody sitting here today is don't try and do what I do. Don't try and think like I think, but try and learn what it would be like if you were to think like I think, and learn how to do that. And I think that's what's important. If I could convince 5 of you to walk out of you here finding out first what canon is so you could become a heretic. You can't be a heretic if you don't know canon. I know canon very, very well. I teach canon, I study canon. I'm better at canon than any probably architect that I know, because I've been teaching for 50 years, and I have to be better than you guys. And to be better than you guys, I got to question. I was with a group of Italian scholars. I gave a lecture 2 weeks ago at the Italian Cultural Institute, and I said, how many of you have ever been to Vigevano? And they looked at me strangely. All Italian, all in art history or architecture or some cultural affairs. And none of them had ever been to Vigevano. And I said, you know, Vigevano is the best piazza in Italy. It was designed by Bramante, and the fact that none of you have ever been there is amazing. Now, I'm not going to challenge this audience because too many of you are knowledgeable, but I'll bet a lot of you students, even the ones who've been to the Rome program, have never been to Vigevano, okay? And I would just say, before I get to see the pictures, there's one place that you all should go. It's not necessarily the Piazza San Marco. It's not necessarily Red Square in Moscow. Go to Vigevano and see what an incredible public space is like. And then you will understand what I'm talking about, because in order to make a great public space, you have to know what one is like. And one of the great ones in the world you haven't been to. With that as a challenge, I'm certain Evan has been to Vigevano, but I don't know how many of your students have. Probably not. I would think probably not for 41 years.
It's a place. It's a place.
To make sure they're earning their 45. You guys
Why
are
I mention
earning.
this place? It's we should go.
Okay. I know Evan has had an education. That's why, you know, he is a top-down guy masquerading at the masquerade ball of today as he's top down. He knows too much to be bottom up. I can tell you that. Okay, I'm going to show you I hope I am. There we go. In 1999, there was a competition for a city of culture outside of the town of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, Spain. Galicia is the poorest, most backward area of Spain, the most backward region, and thriving on fishing and farming and pilgrimage, because Santiago is one of the three Catholic venues, Rome and Jerusalem being the other, where you can get final absolution if you make a pilgrimage to any one of these three places. And so every year 1 million people come to Santiago to come to the cathedral. But Santiago was losing population. They were losing young people because there was nothing to do in Santiago. And so the president of the region said, you know, I want to do something like Bilbao. Because Bilbao, the Frank Gehry Museum, made Bilbao into a tourist attraction. It changed the economy of the region. And he said, we need to do the same thing. We need to have more people here who are not just religious pilgrims. We need to have places for our young. We have to be part of the international cultural condition. And so they had a competition where they invited Red Koolhaas, Jean Nouvel, Stephen Hall, Daniel Libeskind, Ricardo Bofill, etc. All of the, I think there were 9 or 10 heroes at the time. And we were one of the people invited to enter this competition. When we thought about it, and the site was on a hillside, we thought, well, we cannot out-Rem, we cannot out-Danny, we can't out-do Jean Nouvel. We gotta do something different, right? And so we're gonna do a mountaintop and slice cuts in it, like slicing a cheese slicer or a sausage slicer, and have no building, in other words, just the mountaintop. And it was so unique and unusual and didn't look like all the other beautiful models and things that were presented that they said, let's build this. Maybe it was the beginning of a bottom-up mentality, you know, that it didn't look like architecture. It certainly didn't look like top-down architecture, didn't look like anything. And there is the model that we made. And of course, for 1999, it was pretty unique. Now, what was the model? On the, you see 9 squares, and what we did was a series of diagrams that you can see that deal with the idea of the town of Santiago as a pilgrimage site. And what the town had was 5 fingers, which were the 5 pilgrimage routes to the center of the town. So we took those 5 fingers and put them on the hill in between the pilgrimage route and the town itself to produce not a destination, but a filter, so that you would, the pilgrims would be forced to walk through culture on their way to religion. In other words, they'd be forced to deal with the secular on the way to the religious. Not as a destination, because these people were not interested as culture as a destination. So we took the 5 fingers and we put them on the site as a notation of a medieval history. And then we said, well, there are other kinds of notations that we need to make on this particular site. And the second was topographical. In other words, it wasn't just a flat drawing, but it had hilly topography. And so we allowed the hilly topography to push these routes, which were flat in town, and to distort them in various ways. And you can see that in these diagrams. And the third distortion that we needed to make was something of today, and that was the vectors of a digital topography, a digital diagram. And so we entered into the landscape, the history of the site, a digital component, and produced this, which was a summation of notations which mean absolutely nothing, but are a series of coordinates that we were going to mark in the architecture. That is, what you're looking at are a series of drawings that have the fingers of the town, the distortion through the topography, the distortions from the digital vectors, all into a kind of, as it were, a jazz sextet. The 6 buildings on the site, contrapuntally playing with each other and reverberating back and forth. So it wasn't just individual buildings, but these buildings notating various organizations. And these came into a, not only did we have the historical medieval paths, not only we have the topographical, not only we have the digital, but we had a 4th layer, which was the Cartesian. And so we had 2 Cartesian grids, a digital vectoral grid, a topographical grid, and a medieval grid, all into the space as a complex layering system. And it is this idea that Andy Saunders took and turned into a digital model. In other words, made it a three-dimensional model from which we could build buildings. And here you can see the site plan of the project. There are 6 buildings in the site plan, and what did I do with the, here we are, this building here is the archive building. This is the library building. This is the concert hall building, the administration building, and over here are 2 museums, the Museum of Galicia and the Museum of Technological Innovation. These were the 6 buildings that we were commissioned in the year 2000 to build. Now, the interesting problem is in Spain, as in many European countries, building is not necessarily done by development companies, but by cities and municipalities and regions. And the region contracted for all 6 buildings by 1992, 93, and let the contracts, and all the money was there. The problem is that when you're working with a community and you don't spend the money doesn't go to the next year, it just goes back into the community. So the money that we had in 1992, by the time we got to 2007 and 2008, when Spain's economy went into the tank, was no longer there. So what you're going to see tonight is you're going to see 4.5 of the 6 buildings that we managed to finish, 4 of them in operation now. The 5th one is partly finished, the 6th one never started. Unfortunately, Spain has no economy right now, and so we are on hold. As someone said, it took 20 years to build the cathedral. It'll take probably 20 years to finish the project. Here you get an idea of what the countryside is like and what the buildings become part of the landscape. This is a view looking down at the west facade of the Cathedral of Santiago, the convent, which is here, the cathedral, the town square, and you see our library building up there, not the library, the museum building on the hillside. And here, again, you get another view of the site as these buildings sit as man-made natural extrusions in the landscape. One of the important issues for us was there's always been a thought that the inside should read as the outside and vice versa in modern architecture. And what we purposely wanted to do was have the outside be stone and the inside be pure white, so that there was a great distinction between the inside and the outside. Very much like I've always reminded of the first cottonmouth rattlesnake that I saw, with this, very intricate patterning of diamonds on the outside of a darkened skin, and when you open the mouth, is this pure white inside. Very frightening. And I always think of that image when I think of that time when I first still fight. Here is the project as it stands today. You can see on the lower part of the site the archive building, which which runs into the library building. Then you see a gap, and you see a partial construction. And then to the north is the administration building, and the large lump building is the museum. Just to understand how big this project is, that circular building in the distance is an auditorium for 12,000 people. So the scale of this is quite large. It's about, so far, 1 million square foot built at a cost of approximately $224 million, which is about $224 a square foot, which we think is a phenomenal price, given that Rafael Moneo, for his Prado Museum in Madrid, spent $650 a square foot. So we're very pleased with the fact that we only spent $224 a square foot. And here's another view of the project. Again, to the right is the archive building. In the center, you have the library building. Then you have the hole in the ground, and you can see the foundation of the music hall, and the far building, the administration. Here is a picture of the up close at sunset, and I think the interesting thing about what you're seeing in this slide is you don't see any chimneys, you don't see any exhaust, you don't see any roof fans or anything. And the reason for that is that since we wanted the thing to be without building-like accoutrements, we built a double-layer roof. And so 3 meters or 10 feet below what you're seeing is the real roof with all of the fans, exhausts, ducts, etc. And then we built a permeable roof of stone above it, so the water runs through to the waterproof roof below it, and we see no waterproofing, no grout or anything, just the natural stone, both vertically and horizontally, which gives an entirely different idea of what buildings look like. And here you can see up close the construction of the stone. It's the first time we did stone as a building, and of course we used it not like stone to emphasize its material characteristic, but to make it look like not stone, even though it's real local stone called quartzita. This is a picture that looks from the front building is the archive building, looking back to the rear building, which is the museum. And here we see people walking on what we call the caminos, that is the exact replica of the pilgrimage routes from down in the town, transposed to the site, with the archive building to the left and the library building to the right. And here is a picture of the archive building, and it's the first time you can really get a good look at the two towers. And the two towers, as I told Evan, are very symbolic for me because they were designed, excuse me, by a close friend of mine and a teacher of Evan's, John Hayter. John was an ardent Catholic, had made a pilgrimage for redemption to Santiago, had written a book of poems for Santiago, and had designed what I would consider a church for Santiago. This was the last project that John was working on before he died of cancer, and he had believed all his life that his Catholicism would ensure him to overcome physical sickness. And he realized that the will of his being could not withstand the will of nature. And so gradually, this cathedral lost its body and turned into two towers of a west facade, which you're looking at, without the cathedral body. And this is what he wanted in Santiago. And on his deathbed, I promised John that we would build these two towers, this cathedral without a body, to symbolize his great feeling for this place. And when you stand to the left of those two towers and look between them, one is all stone and one is all glass, it frames the towers of the cathedral downtown. So it has an enormous symbolic value for the people who are there. It's also a very symbolic value for me because my promise for John to build those towers for him. This is the front facade of looking back from the towers to see the stone buildings. And I show this because next to it, I wanted to show these two images of the interior of the archive building. The archive building has, in this entry area, has a glass floor. Why does it have a glass floor? To make one aware of the, as it were, the pochette in the ceiling. And the lines and volumes in the ceiling have nothing to do with air conditioning or ducts or lighting. They have to do with the overall notation of these various grids, the topographical, topological, digital, Cartesian, that are in the project. And so in case you're not looking up, when you look down, you see, in fact, that there's something very strange about the ceiling. And so these two shots, as you come in from this very blank exterior, show you something about what is happening on the interior. The archive building, the ceilings, the grids, there are many different notations. You can see them in the floor, you can see them in the ceiling, you can see them on the walls. And these notations go from building to building so that they're just not here, but they continue through into the other four buildings. How one got to this, it wasn't, gee, we thought this was going to look nice. It was where the notational system exhausted itself, let's say, where we couldn't take it any further without becoming beyond any kind of recognition. And there's no recognition. You can't look at this and say, gee, I better look at the plan, because it's not about plan, and it's not about the reflected ceiling plan. It's about all of these things in a kind of three-dimensional matrix. Could we have done it without the computer? No. Could we have conceptualized it without the computer? Probably not. But the combination of the idea of doing a building that was what we would call a text, a notational system, without being representational. In other words, it didn't refer to anything other than its development as a building, its process of becoming. These are various shots in the archive building to show you the tremendous energy and differentiation of form that occupies the space. It is a lot of architecture. Do we need this around us? No. It's like a rich meal in a 3-star French restaurant. We don't need any more. more meals like this for another month. You don't need any more buildings like this around. So we're never worried that the environment will come to look like this. This is a special city of culture, not the city, but the city of culture. And it, I think, advertises that in a very clear and straightforward way. Now, we go back outside, and this is the entryway moving from, on the left, the archive building, which we were just in. We come out of that, and we come into the arcade of the library building. And there is the arcade of the, again, moving to that arcade. The next slide shows something that has become one of the most interesting parts of the project. Since we wanted the ground to not be level, let's say, and the buildings not sitting on a level ground, we made the ground come up and join the buildings so that there was no ground and no figure, but a kind of relationship that we call figure-figure. And so this is the nose of the library with the ground coming up, the plaza coming up to meet the building. People are not supposed to walk on that, but it's the only place, for some reason, that people want to walk. And we have rollerbladers, skateboarders, all kinds of things. And somebody actually fell off, which wasn't too nice. But we told them not to go there. There are little signs that say, do not go there. And you can see that quite obviously something is attracting them to do that. It's extreme build, let's say. I don't know how else to say it. But it is an interesting public space, and we use it in the summertime for seating, for outdoor concerts. It's a perfect place to put down a blanket and some sangria and enjoy the outdoors.
Beaches.
Of course, that's what we were thinking about when we did it, which is not true. It just so happens to be functional. Again, back to the entry of the library. And then the inside of the library, moving from south to north from the entrance. And this is the, looking down, this is before the books got in, the rare book library. And again, one of the things that's interesting about this top-down approach is that the Minister of Culture, when he first saw our library, said, how many books are here? He said, well, there'll be 250,000 books. And he said, we're not building a library for 250,000 books. He said, I want a great library. Make it 1 million. And so he had to redesign the whole damn thing to not have 250,000 books, but 1 million books. Now, of course, there aren't 1 million books in Galicia. But I imagine that someday the idea that they have 1 million books will be an important one. Right now, they want soup kitchens. The library, looking from east to west, the very many different levels of the library and the built-in reading spaces. There's a whole variety of spaces, but you can see the play between this building and the archive building. In fact, you might not even think you were in another building. Again, the section is always moving through the space, and the slide on the right, you can can see the glass on the far right-hand side of the slide is the exterior north wall, and then you come across the staircase and you see another facade, and that is an interior facade, which is where the Rare Book Library is. So there are a series of layers of space. It's not inside or outside, but the layering of space goes from building to building and also internally within the building. Two other shots of the interior of the library. And this is looking down from above. You can see the top level on the left, the intermediate level in the center, and then looking down into the Rare Book Library. So the cascading of sectional layers in the building, all to do with a notation and not to do with this. We didn't design this, and that's one of the things that's interesting. This is not an emergent system, but rather a different form of what is known today as emergence. That is neither design, but one is a notational system, the other is a quasi-formal system. Here you see that the nose of the museum was very difficult to pour the concrete because of the angle of the project. Again, it's a little too steep to stand on. There are people who have slid down that slide. It's not recommended. In fact, it's not what it was intended for. But those are the consequences of building. I like this image because it's the north facade of the museum building. The layers of it's not a curtain wall, but glass as volumetric. And you can see the volumetric nature of the glass like shards of stone as you see on the right hand of the slide. So the play between the natural and the man-made has, I think a very interesting juxtaposition. And there's another view looking from the west to the east of the north facade of the cathedral. You can see that it layers out, and in fact, the slope starts in and moves out as it goes down. So there's a double curvature in the surface. And every piece of glass had to be pre-ordered and pre-measured, not from any set of working drawings, but a set of coordinate drawings, so that the pieces of glass, in a sense, came out of the model that was developed for this particular facade. And they all fit, which is really quite extraordinary. Again, the north facade on the left and the south facade of the same building on the right. Inside of the museum building, and you can see on the right the internal structure, a series of open web column which hold that three-dimensional glass that you saw on the outside. So you have that facade, and then again, like in the museum, like in the library, the museum has an internal facade so that you get a series not only of different scales, different dimensions, but again, this layering of space from outside to inside. And looking back the other way to the glass facade as it steps out, and the internal facade working with, you see the column right center, poking through the ribs of the poche of that interior wall. Something that you see the play of these forms, and it's just a riot of different spatial energies. And now we're looking at the means of vertical movement through escalator up through the 3 different levels of the museum. Again, the 3 levels, as you see from another point of view. And again, the escalators behind the facade that you see on the right-hand picture, which you saw before. And then you get to the end of the journey, and you look to the north and see framed in the glass in the lower right the towers of the cathedral down below. So there is constantly the play between the town and the organization of the space in between. Again, a reflection of the various forms of the landscape and urban forms in the north facade of the museum building. Here is one of my favorite views, looking east from the museum building to the archive building. This is the 4th building we're going to look at. And here's the corner of the archive building as seen from the museum. And you see the archive building from the nose cone of the library looking north. And then you can see the play of the landscape of the roofs, the roof in the rear being the museum, and the roof in the foreground being the archive building. And several of my favorite slides coming up, this is the last building that we finished, so we got more adept at making strange things happen. And here you can see the carving away of the stone facade to reveal the glass facade inside of the administration building. One of my favorite moments. I tell you that it takes years and years of understanding what architecture is to be able to deploy any of it in building. And there's no way that one could do this without experiencing architecture. So I would argue that the one marvelous thing about school, it's a speed bump between high school and getting a job. But it's also a chance to get out of your skin and go to places like going to Rome and seeing buildings and things. But it's not enough to just go and see. You have to know what you're looking at. You have to learn to see. And I can remember when I was a student like you all, I was taken by Colin Rowe at a young age to Europe in 1961 when there were no guidebooks and hardly anybody knew where Palladio was, but Colin was a person who knew every Palladian villa. And he put me on a 95-degree humid day in front of a Palladian facade while he sat down and had a beer in a outdoor cafe. And he said, "Peter, you stand there until you can tell me something about that facade that you can't see." I don't know what the hell he was talking about. And the way I learned to see was to learn how to see what wasn't there. for me, architecture is not about the phenomena of presence, about the being in presence, but the phenomena of the being in presence, of being presenting you with what isn't there. And I remember finally understanding what it meant to tell Colin Rowe what wasn't there. And what I think is important for your education, and it's an education that is unlike any other, is learning to see as an architect. Why we have such bad journalism in this country, and especially in our daily newspapers, is because the people that write about architecture have never been trained as architects to see architects. To be able to see like an architect means to be able to see what's not there. And if I can leave you with anything, it's trying to understand what that conundrum is, because architecture is supposed to be being there. And the whole idea for architecture is to see what's not there and to present you with that possibility, not just what is, but what isn't. And to me, that's what makes architecture such a fascinating and top-down experience. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes if there are any comments, questions. We can talk about ice hockey. I see RPI play all the time. They don't usually do too well against RPI, but this year they're better off. There are three teams, in case you didn't know it, in the Frozen Four that are from New England. And two of them are teams that I see play all the time. So
we're better than Yale, right?
Yale's in the Frozen Four. You beat them once. That's all you need. That's right. And you beat Cornell once, too.
And we beat Harvard.
Yeah, and you beat Harvard. Harvard was at the bottom. Anyway, so
Let's play this like I'm
I'm more
talking.
interested in ice hockey than I am architecture. I'm glad to see they put a new facade on the rink since I've been here. It looks great. But anything you want to ask me, please. No.
Nobody?
We have Eric.
Maybe we can talk about swimming, because I was a swimmer.
I swam at Cornell. Yeah. That's how I became an architect.
But I'd like to go back to the part of the lecture where you briefly mentioned the idea of somewhat tearing your heroes down, or in a way that the obligation would be. Are you aware of that part that
Go ahead.
I'm speaking of? I don't know what part of the lecture it was, but it was intermingled with your comments about the political.
Go ahead. And I said what?
Something about dismissing heroes or tearing them down.
Yeah, I think that architecture is one of the few disciplines that eats its heroes.
Yeah. And Kazuo Sejima has an interesting point where she said that it's kind of an oddity because in American architectural culture that seems to be the prevalent disposition.
Right.
And
Which is not the case in Japan, by